Flow of blood through your circulatory system is a function both of the pressure, the blood pressure that your heart creates, and also of resistance from the blood vessels, right? If you have especially narrower, right, and longer blood vessels, that creates more resistance. Wider blood vessels means less resistance, because fewer of the blood cells, for instance, are rubbing up against the side and creating friction. That's why even though the blood pressure continuously goes down from your arteries into your veins, the velocity comes down but then pops back up. And that's because you have wider vessels and less surface area in terms of your veins. And so you end up with a little bit more pressure in here because there's less surface area, and a little bit less resistance because there are wider vessels, which allows your blood to return via your veins to your heart, even though it doesn't have nearly as much pressure. The pressure is almost gone. Additionally, because of this lack of pressure, your veins have to have valves. And the valves are little pieces of tissue that prevent backflow. So once blood squirts through here, it's very easy to move this way through a valve, but then blood falls back down, fills up these sides, pushes the valve back together, and it can't go back. So valves prevent backflow. And this is important. It's like being able to save your level on a video game, right? So you can try all the craziest things you want. If you're saved, you already got it to level 5. Every time you die, you just start back over at level 5. And also, you have these skeletal muscles that surround a lot of your veins. And every time you move or contract a muscle, it squeezes, and it's like squeezing the middle of a toothpaste container. It's going to send some of that toothpaste up, but it's going to send none of it back because these valves are there preventing backflow, right? And so movement of your skeletal muscles helps venous return of blood, as does breathing. Can do the same thing. It squeezes blood vessels in your chest. And in between the arteries that come out and the veins that come back, you have capillaries where there's exchange. And the exchange is a function of both diffusion, but also actual flow of things back and forth because of blood pressure that's pushing things out through little tiny pores in the capillaries, and osmotic pressure that sucks fluid back in, especially toward the end, because you have a lot of solutes in here, things that are dissolved, like proteins that are too big to move out, but they kind of suck water back in. So you push fluid out, plus tiny things like glucose and amino acids and sodium, and then you pull things back in, like water, so there's water for the veins on the way back. Looking at the components of blood, it's a little over 50%, about 55% plasma, and a little under 50%, usually around 45%, formed elements, which means cells. Now that's almost entirely red blood cells. The vast, vast majority, over 99% of the formed elements are red blood cells, which carry oxygen because they're full of hemoglobin. And then you have platelets, which assist in blood clotting. And then you have white blood cells, or leukocytes, and there are several different kinds, but all of them have some role in immune defense. Within your plasma, it's mostly water, 90% water at least. But then beyond the water, you also have things dissolved in that water. And that's the difference between these formed elements and the stuff in the plasma, is the stuff is dissolved. And that includes electrolytes like sodium and calcium and things like that. Buffers, also proteins like albumin, fibrinogen, immunoglobulins, which are antibodies, which are pretty relevant these days. And then nutrients like glucose and amino acids, waste products like urea, respiratory gases like CO2, things like that. And then hormones. Hormones have to be transported through the blood plasma. If a big function of the circulatory system is to deliver oxygen to tissues and remove CO2 from tissues, you need to have a big gas exchange organ to load up the blood with oxygen and get rid of that CO2 from the oxygen. And so we call those things usually lungs or gills, depending on whether they're exchanging with the air or with water. Either way, the whole idea is diffusion, right? A gas makes up a certain amount of the pressure of the total air or water, and it's called a partial pressure. So the vast majority of the gas in our air is nitrogen. That means nitrogen makes up the majority of the partial pressure. Next comes oxygen. And partial pressure, you can look at that essentially as meaning concentration, because gases always move from a higher partial pressure to a lower partial pressure, just like things move from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. That's effectively what that is. So if we want oxygen to continuously diffuse into our blood, we have to make sure that we have air or water that we're moving into our respiratory surface that is continuously of higher oxygen partial pressure or concentration than our blood is. And what that respiratory surface is going to look like could be very different between organisms. So all of these are considered gills because they're exchanging gases with water. But in a marine annelid, those gills are really on the parapodia. They're just places where you have large surface area on the parapodia. For crustaceans like crayfish, they're part of the legs. You have those feathery extensions of the legs up top, and they're considered gills. In a sea star, the tube feet are the extensions of surface area that allow for exchange. So it's very different depending on the type of organism, but you have to have some structure with a lot of surface area that allows for exchange with your environment. And you have to have a way of moving that medium, either air or water, across your respiratory surface, your gills or your lungs. And we call that process of moving the respiratory medium, air or water, across the respiratory surface, gills or lungs, ventilation. So for us, ventilation is breathing, right? We bring the medium air across our lungs, which are the respiratory surface. Here you can see gills are the respiratory surface, and they use their operculum to push water across the gills, and water pushes across this way, and you have all the surface area of blood vessels for exchange. It's interesting because blood is flowing this way, right? Deoxygenated blood is over here, oxygenated blood is over here, water is flowing this way. So here you have your blood at its most oxygenated, and it's the water at its most oxygenated. So you have a gradient where there's more oxygen in the water than in the blood. And as you move over, there's less and less oxygen in this water because it's moved into the blood. But there's also less and less oxygen in the blood because this is where the deoxygenated blood is. And so if the blood flowed the opposite way, you would have a bigger gradient, lots of oxygen in the water, less oxygen in the blood, so you'd get a faster initial diffusion, but you'd only get diffusion at the very beginning. Whereas this way, because you've got a countercurrent exchange, water flowing this way, blood flowing this way, you end up having a diffusion gradient across this entire gill lamina, and that allows you ultimately to move more oxygen into this blood than you would be able to otherwise. And so these are these lamina providing surface area, and each of these filaments has lots of lamina, and ultimately you have tons of surface area on each gill. Insects have an entirely different strategy, where they have these tracheal tubes that instead of bringing all their blood to one spot and having an exchange with air in the one spot, they bring the air all over their body through these tracheal tubes and to supply this oxygen directly to the body cells. So you have all these holes on the outside, these external openings, which are actually called spiracles, and then they conduct the air in through these trachea tubes that branch and become smaller and go to individual body cells. It's really wild. And they can ventilate these tubes by expanding and contracting their body. If they expand, just like the way we expand our thoracic cavity, creates a vacuum inside them and sucks air in, and then they compress their whole body. And then they're able to suck air in and out, and again, take it directly to the cells. It's a wildly different way to go about this. Most other animals, again, have something like gills or lungs. And in this case, we're talking about terrestrial animals, so our respiratory surface are going to be lungs. In humans and most mammals, you have your nasal cavity that air passes through, and through your pharynx, again, your throat, and into your larynx. And so the epiglottis covers your larynx to prevent food from getting down there, but your larynx is your voice box. And then through your trachea, which is your wind tube. And then you branch into bronchi, and you have primary, secondary, tertiary bronchi. They branch into smaller and smaller tubes until you get to bronchioles, which are very tiny tubes that ultimately lead to these alveolar sacs, which are a single squamous cell layer thick. They're very thin, and they're surrounded by capillaries, and this is where gas exchange is able to occur. You breathe in, ventilate oxygen-rich air into your alveoli, and the oxygen diffuses into the oxygen-poor blood here. and then the blood flows away. We bring in more oxygen, poor blood. We breathe out the oxygen, poor air. Breathe in more oxygen-rich air, and allow it to diffuse into that new blood. Now, there are a lot of reasons why this is tricky, and one of them is because our alveoli have to be wet, because ultimately the oxygen has to diffuse into water to diffuse across into the blood, right? But wet, very thin sacs that are wet tend to collapse because the water on one side is attracted to the water on the other side, because water is cohesive because of that polar attraction. There's hydrogen bonds, and so it's really hard to open them up, right? It makes it very difficult to breathe. So we have surfactants, which are amphipathic. They have a hydrophilic end to bind to the water and a hydrophobic end that won't bind with the water on the opposite side. Again, this is essentially just Dawn dish detergent in a sense. And so that allows us to reduce the surface tension, and those alveoli stay inflated instead of collapsing on one another. This is really important because preterm babies, if they're born too early, they lack surfactant, and it's very difficult to breathe, and they're vulnerable to respiratory distress syndrome, and this was often a reason why we'd lose preterm babies. But now we can produce artificial surfactant that can allow these babies to survive. Some animals, like amphibians, ventilate their lungs by positive pressure breathing, which means pushing air down the trachea into the lungs. They essentially do this by gulping air and then swallowing it, pushing it back. Now, we don't do this, right? Amphibians have positive pressure breathing. We have negative pressure breathing. And in negative pressure breathing, we breathe by sucking air into our lungs, not pushing the air. So we create a vacuum by expanding our thoracic cavity, by swinging out our ribs and contracting our diaphragm muscle and making it go down. So this is a contracted diaphragm, creates a much larger space and creates negative pressure, and air, like everything else, moves from high pressure to low. So if the pressure in your thoracic cavity is lower than the atmospheric pressure, air moves in. And then when you collapse your lungs back down, creates more pressure, and you push the air back out because your pressure is higher than the atmospheric pressure. So we create a vacuum by expanding our chest. And this is why you can see people's chest go up and down when they breathe. This is, again, different from amphibians. Birds take it one more step than we do. They're even more efficient than we are in that we have to breathe air in and push air out before we can take our next breath. And just like animals that have to eat and then spit it out the same hole before they can have their next meal, that's less efficient than just being able to continuously breathe. And so birds have a slightly different anatomy that allows them to continuously breathe in a circular fashion because they have 8 or 9 air sacs that keep air bellows moving through the lungs. So air comes in through the mouth, and then it goes into a posterior air sac that then breathes it toward the lungs, and then it continues out this way, and then you have another sac that pushes it back out, but you can breathe in again another time. And so again, you're able to have this circular breathing pattern so that you can continue to take breaths before you've eliminated the old air. Birds need this because not only are they endothermic like mammals and require efficient breathing, but they also fly, and flight is very energetically expensive. No matter how you ventilate your respiratory surface, you have to have something, some kind of respiratory pigment that can bind to oxygen, because oxygen does not dissolve well in water. So for us, that's hemoglobin. For some arthropods and mollusks, that's hemocyanin. They have blue blood because copper is their binding agent, whereas with hemoglobin, iron is ours. But you have to have some sort of pigment that binds effectively to oxygen. Again, for us, that's hemoglobin. And whereas oxygen travels primarily attached to hemoglobin, CO2, when it comes together with water, forms H2CO3, or carbonic acid, which you probably talked about in Bio 131. Carbonic acid, because it's an acid, tends to lose a hydrogen and become hydrogen ion and bicarbonate. And so most CO2 moves through your blood as bicarbonate, and that extra hydrogen ion is bound up in the hemoglobin because it acts like a buffer to keep your blood from becoming too acidic. So your oxygen moves attached to hemoglobin, your carbon dioxide moves as bicarbonate. And mammals that do deep sea diving but only have lungs have to be able to hold their breath for a long time. So they essentially have a lot more blood than you would expect, and they have a lot of whatever pigment they use. In the case of mammals, it's going to be hemoglobin. They may also have excess myoglobin, which is very similar to hemoglobin, but it stays in your muscles. And that means your muscles have lots of oxygen stored for when they need it. And if you need a review, I highly suggest you watch this gas exchange bioflix on Mastering Biology.